Hello, and welcome to the 5th Annual Oxford Economics of Mutuality Forum. It is such a pleasure to be here with you and thousands of additional business executives, thought leaders, academics, heads of global institutions, policymakers, MBA students, and so many more who are advocates for purposeful business around the world. Friends, it has been quite a year. Each of us, from our own unique perspective, have witnessed ways of learning, innovations in collaboration, and myriad opportunities that seemingly didn't exist a few months ago, as a pandemic gripped the world, invaded our communities and families, and impacted our economy. Just a few weeks ago, the one-year anniversary passed of the Business Roundtable's statement that the purpose of business is no longer simply to maximize profits, but rather to create value for all its stakeholders. And this Sunday will mark the 50th anniversary of Milton Friedman's doctrine appearing in the New York Times. We are certainly convening at a unique moment in history. Thank you for being here and for your contribution. We are facing a time to reevaluate, reset, and rebuild together. And we join together to meet the rising challenges the world faces with our shared values and mutual strategies. It's an absolute honor for me to be here with you over the next 3 days. My name is Amanda Catherine Roman, and I'll be serving as your Master of Ceremonies. It is now my pleasure to introduce Colin Mayer and Bruno Roche, who will serve as our guides in transforming business, finance, and education to thrive by meeting the needs of the world. Colin?
My name is Colin Mayer, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to the forum.
And my name is Bruno Roche, and likewise, it's a great honor to co-host this 5th EOM Forum with Oxford SBS and my dear colleague and friend, Colin, with whom I have been working on the Economics of Mutuality program at the Saïd Business School for the past 6 years.
There have indeed been dramatic changes to the global economy since we last met in May 2019. These developments have only served to emphasize the urgency and significance of the forum's agenda. It's no longer just climate change and environmental issues that are at the heart of the agenda. It has been joined by health, social inclusion, and inequality. Why are we facing progressively a larger number and steadily more intense set of crises? The answer, I suggest, is the deficiency of existing ways of doing business and running our capitalist system. What's wrong? Well, that Friedman doctrine that appeared in the New York Times 50 years ago stated that there is one and only one social purpose of business: to increase profits so long as it stays within the rules of the game. And that's been the basis of business practice, business leadership, business policy, and business education ever since. Its consequences have been increasingly damaging. It's been the cause of growing environmental degradation, inequality, social exclusion, and mistrust. Why? Well, we center our economies and our businesses around that notion of pursuing profit. And to the extent that profit is measured net of the costs of production, it's in the interests of firms and their shareholders to minimize costs as far as they can. And that means that from the point of view of the various stakeholders, that companies should increase profits by cutting costs and reducing investment, even if that involves employing people in precarious jobs or paying below living wages. Employees are a cost center, and there's an incentive to reduce that cost center. Likewise, suppliers of material goods and services are a cost center, and there is an incentive to reduce those as well. Polluting the environment and over-exploiting natural resources follows naturally when one thinks in terms of minimizing costs of material, natural resources, failing to restore them to their original state, or sustaining them going forward. The disposal and treatment of waste is a cost, but again, it's in the incentive of companies to try and shift onto others. Taxes are a cost, so avoiding taxes so long as it doesn't violate laws and regulation or incur reputational costs that exceed the profits that it generates is again something that companies seek to minimize. Now that's, if you think about it, a terrible way of organizing our societies and economies regarding employees, suppliers, the environment, tax and contribution to the provision of public services as merely costs to be minimized. And problems will in the process get worse before they get better, because while technology offers tremendous possibilities of enhancing human well-being, it also poses huge risks of bringing about changes that could create considerable and unforeseeable damage in the future.
Well, thank you, Colin. I'd like to add on Colin's words to say that, quoting King Solomon of 3,000 years ago, that to everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to break down and a time to build up. And indeed, since the article of Friedman exactly 50 years ago, the world has changed dramatically, at least across 4 dimensions. The first dimension is there are new forms of scarcities. Economics is often described as a science, social science, involved in the management of scarcity. Scarcities have changed dramatically over the last 50 years, but the economic model that was supposed to adjust to managing them has not changed. Financial capital today is overly abundant, while it was scarce in the early 70s. Our economy needs now 1.8 planet, while it needed 1 planet only in the early 70s. And today, inequality have skyrocketed. I mean, just a few numbers here, like the top 1% owns 45% of all global personal wealth. The top 10% owns 82%, while the bottom 50% owns less than 1%. The second dimension is that over the last 50 years, multinational corporations have also gained tremendously in size. Today, 69 of the top 100 economies are multinational corporations. So de facto, these large corporation companies have a societal role, but they are not equipped to handle the new responsibilities and that their size and influence confer on them. The third dimension that is changing the way we do business is that we are moving now quite fast from what we call an industrial and service economy into a knowledge and digital economy, which is called the fourth industrial revolution. Today, 88% of the S&P 500 assets are intangible. 50 years ago, it was just the opposite. 85% of the assets were tangible. And while the previous industrial and service economy was financial capital intensive, in the new knowledge and digital economy that we are working in, financial capital is not as intensely required, but social and human capital in particular are in great demand. This transition from a capital-intensive economy to a less capital-intensive economy is actually accelerating the shift away from focusing on financial capital to deliver financial performance. And then the COVID. Well, the COVID actually has hit us. It's not a new thing in such, because the pandemic happened in the past, but it's revealing actually the weaknesses of the system that we have built. And today, a recent survey said that 90% of business leaders believe that the COVID will fundamentally change the way they do business. And our argument is that up until the COVID, business could maintain the tension or the hypocrisy of maximizing profit with one hand and attempting to look good with the other hand through CSR activities and ESG reporting. Our argument is that this is no longer possible because COVID has revealed the identity crisis that results from managing this untenable tension. The old saying said that no one can serve two masters without one of them being cheated. And an argument is that a new breed of business leaders is required and will arise to embrace the duty and also the opportunity, and I would even say the greater opportunity, to reposition their business in such a way that they will thrive by meeting the needs of the world. It's not a philosophy, it's an imperative. Business existed before capitalism. It will exist after capitalism. Capitalism is in a way a short parenthesis in the history of business and need to be reformed and or completed in order to be in service of the business. And I think we are at such a point of time. The cheated party has been our people, our communities, and our environment. We now need a system change, a great transition, a reform. And actually, I'm speaking today from Geneva, the city of reformation, and it reminds us actually that reform is possible. The good news is that we are not starting from zero. And over the last decade, especially since the 2000 crisis, hundreds of organizations, and actually we've counted 180 of them, hundreds of books, papers, conferences, movements, all have emerged to attempt to create this system change, to turn the system upside down and enforce finance to be in service of business, to enforce business to be in service of the economy, and eventually the economy to be in service of society. And promising new schools of thoughts with tested practical innovation have emerged that show it's possible to transform value creation models in business and finance. And we believe actually that these approaches have now the potential to empower business to outperform by solving key social and key environmental challenges in the ecosystem in which they operate. Together, such development have the potential to galvanize support among business leaders, investors, and management schools to think and act outside the box. In the coming days, we want to honor and recognize the great work that has been accomplished by many organizations in that field. And it's not a small thing. There has been a lot of effort and good work. And really, from our intention with Colin and organizers, we want to honor the work that has been done. The great disappointment, however, is that this great transition is yet to come. Society and the planet are still in service of the economy, and the economy is still in service of finance, and finance is still in service of itself. And the issue is neither the lack of activity nor the absence of goodwill. Business investors wishing to adopt responsible business practices are drowning in a sea of ESG reporting, valuation, accounting that is actually confusing and sometimes even contradictory. And for those thinking to make investments or allocate resources, evaluate performance, manage portfolio, or motivate employees, the confusion risks creating chaos. And alas, the road to hell is often paved with good intentions. And the issue is that progress are not sufficient and not fast enough. They're not sufficient and fast enough because, in our view and humble view, that there is a lack of shared understanding of the nature of the problems and the lack of understanding of the levers of change to trigger a system change. As a French man, I was reading as a young man The Plague of Albert Camus, and he said something which resonates today. He said, to name things wrongly is to add misery to the world. I repeat that, to unname or to name things wrongly is to add misery to the world. If you define the purpose of business wrongly, you're adding misery to the world. If you measure profit wrongly, you're bringing misery to the world. If you educate leaders wrongly, you're multiplying misery to the world. And the corollary of this could be, if you define the purpose of business properly, you're useful to the world. If you measure profit rightly, you're bringing prosperity to the world. And if you educate leaders wisely, you're multiplying positive impact to the world. This is a great transition that the world needs, and it must start with this shared understanding of the nature of problems, failures, and breakdown of the level of change. And the level of change are three. The first one is the redefinition of corporate purpose. The second one is the measurement of performance and the redefinition of profit. And some of you know actually that the economics of mutuality journey started in 2007 with a question coming from the board of Mars Incorporated. And the question was the following: what should be the right level of profit? And the question was asked not because we wanted to make more money, or based on we wanted to make less money. The question was, what is the right level of profit that would maximize the performance of the firm? And our journey started with this question, and 14 years later, we are now in the position to answer to this question in hopefully a way that will convince you. The third lever is, of course, education, education of existing and the future business leaders. People perish because of lack of education. People perish because of lack of knowledge. So the notion of education is critically important. So this is the objective of the forum, and to empower business leaders and management school to educate leaders so that they can thrive in their business by meeting the needs of the world.
Thank you, Bruno. The first of these 3 sessions of the forum over the next 3 days will elaborate on the problems and failures of our existing business and economic system and the consequences of that. We need, first of all, to recognize that the real purpose of business is exactly the mirror and opposite image of the Friedman doctrine. It's to produce profitable solutions to problems we face as people and planet, and to do so in a commercial and profitable way and at scale. In other words, to produce profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet, and not to profit from producing problems for either. Now, that's a precise description of a business purpose. It's not woolly or vague. It's neither just a mission statement of what a company does, nor a vision statement of what a company aspires to do in terms of saving the world. It's precise of what problems a company seeks to solve, for whom, when, how it will solve them, and why the company is well suited to solve those problems. In other words, it's about why the company exists, why it was created, its reason for being, namely its purpose. Now, we're going to exemplify this with several cases that will be discussed in the case study sessions that come after the main forum events. One example of a company in the tech sector that is seeking to enact corporate purpose is Microsoft. Satya Nadella recently announced as the CEO of Microsoft an ambitious program to make Microsoft carbon zero in relation to scope 1 and 2 of its activities by the middle of this decade, and carbon neutral in relation to scope 3 by 2030. It's illustrative of the second part of that purpose statement that I made, not profiting from producing problems for people or planet. Key to demonstrating this is a credible commitment to measuring a company's purpose and whether a company is enacting its purpose, measuring whether it's producing solutions or problems, its impact, and its consequence for its performance, namely its profits. This emphasizes 2 points. First, that profits are not a purpose of business, they are a consequence of a purpose. They are not a purpose as such. Now, the way in which we define and measure profits should ensure that companies are not earning from producing problems. In the second session tomorrow, we will argue that this involves some fundamental changes in the way in which we conceive of performance and the way in which we measure profits. The forum is being organized in conjunction with many movements that are seeking to change our business and economic system to address its problems. As we will describe shortly, we've created a map of our economic system, some of which you've just seen, the problems associated with it, and the role that the movements are seeking to play in addressing them. What emerges is that this is a systems issue. There is a need to engage not in piecemeal reform, but in a systematic change of a corporate system. That requires a degree of coordination across the movements that, for the most part, has not been present to date. In the third session, we'll describe an approach to identify the policy levers that are required to bring about this systems change. And we're going to focus on one area that is critically important and at the heart of what we do in the business school in Oxford, and that is education. What are the educational changes, the curriculum and courses that are required to produce the leaders, individual virtues, and organizational values and cultures that are needed for purposeful business. I'll argue that this involves some fundamental reforms to the way in which we conceive of business education. So if there are just three messages that I would like you to take away from the 3 days of the forum, they are the following. First, we need a fundamental change in our business and capitalist system, away from a focus on profit as purpose to profit as a product of purpose, where purpose itself is about solving problems of people and planet. Second, we need a fundamental change in the way in which we measure corporate performance, away from the current notion of business purpose being about profit to it being about solving problems, and to redefine the measurement of profit so that it's not associated with producing problems. Third, we need to fundamentally change our business education away from it being about corporate purpose to produce profit to it being about corporate purpose to solve problems, not profiting from producing problems.
Sorry, I was mute. Actually, this is at the heart of the economics of mutuality. It is what drives the program that we've been developing together with Oxford and with Mars. And to that extent, there is also like a couple of messages I would like to retain, is that economics of mutuality is not a management philosophy. It is not a moral doctrine. It is a school of thought and a management innovation that deciphers some natural laws in economics and business and leverage them to create value. It demonstrates that capitalism, financial capitalism, is a suboptimal model for all parties. That a model that extracts value for a few is less efficient, even for the happy few, than a model that creates value for many. That the winners take all approach that actually has been popularized recently, which is systematically favoring those with power, is less efficient than an approach based on mutual relationships between stakeholders aligned behind a common purpose, and a purpose which is what Colin described, which is actually to create profitable solutions to the problem of people and planet. And that is the good news that we want to share over the next 3 days. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruno and Colin, for laying out what is sure to be a series of rousing conversations and learnings together over the next number of days. I'd now like to invite Paul Pullman to join us here on our virtual stage for a conversation with Colin Mayer about why systemic business transformation is so urgently needed and who can help us bring that about. So I'll turn it back over to you, Colin.
Thanks very much. Paul Pullman, as you'll all be aware, is a founder and chairman of Imagine, which is accelerating business leadership to achieve the global goals. He's chairman of the board of the Saïd Business School, and he's a former CEO of Unilever. Paul, welcome, and thank you very much indeed for being with us.
Thank you, Colin, for the opportunity.
Paul, perhaps I could just begin by asking you, how well do you think that we've done to date in terms of reforming business for the 21st century?
Well, it is fair to say that if we are results focused, we have a mixed record. Even before the COVID crisis, climate change was heading toward 3.5 degrees. Inequality was going up. And frankly, issues like gender diversity and balance would have taken us 250 years to achieve. So if the ultimate goal is to create a more sustainable and equitable and inclusive society now and for generations to come, we've done a lousy job. And I think the reality is that the society at large would not have business score high. You see that in the trust factors overall, and you see that in the increasing demand from civil society for more responsible business models. Unfortunately, the first step has been at the polls, something that was in more immediate reach, or often in the streets, as we now see in many countries. But that has translated in populism or nationalism or xenophobia in some cases that has made the issues worse. Now, coming to COVID, I think COVID has brought some more light to the issue, also for many of the CEOs that were not enlightened yet. It has shown that we cannot have healthy people on an unhealthy planet. It has also shown the importance of the social side of ESG and the importance of providing now social inclusion, including racial inclusion now. And probably it has also made people aware that actually within the crisis, the companies that were run under a multi-stakeholder longer-term model, or the financial market that had invested in serious ESG funds, have done a little bit better. At least the initial indications are like that. So hopefully we're at the beginning of a more important change, an opportunity we frankly missed during the financial crisis in 2008, 2009.
Thank you. So do you think that the Business Roundtable has really lived up to its statement of a year ago?
Well, the Business Roundtable statement was received to be revolutionary at that time when 184 companies signed it. Consequently, 220 companies have signed it. It even made WEF, Klaus Schwab, declared this the moment of stakeholder capitalism. And that was the theme of the WEF as well earlier this year. We are 1 year on now. There are some studies out that show that the companies from the that have signed up to the statement broadly have done a little better than the rest of the market. But I think that probably was baked in terms of the nature of the companies and already probably being a little bit ahead of the pack. If you ask the tougher question, what have these companies truly changed 1 year on? It's difficult to see. Not many have signed up to the Paris Agreement based on science-based targets. We know that we cannot really afford to be above 1.5 degrees. Many people are going to suffer. Costs are going to be extraordinarily high. We also know we have the solutions. So why are these companies not speaking up? We still haven't seen collective commitments of scale where these companies went together and translated it into action. In fact, most have been awfully silent with the actions, especially of the US administration right now, many of them actually not in the interest long-term of people and society. For example, on reporting of ESG or protecting our valuable public land from further exploration of fossil fuel, which we don't need anymore. And then last but not least, although there have been some companies that have signed the statement that have taken specific actions on the social and inclusion side, I think it has been mainly absent in many of these companies. So yes, the statement was to a certain extent good. It put shareholders at par with the other stakeholders. For America, that's considered to be revolutionary. I've always operated under the principle that shareholder return is a function of serving the other stakeholders well, not an objective in itself. So I would have gone farther. But at the end of the day, I would say the jury is still out into how this translates into responsible action.
Okay, so if the jury is still out, what is it that's really going to affect change? What should business be doing?
Well, it boils down to a very simple thing, that is us as human beings. I think if we would run business with a little bit more humanity, instead of the spreadsheets and the numbers that you've referred to, it would go a long way. I think many of the business leaders still have not internalized the severity of the issue that we need to face and how they can do something about it. Many are not aware of the science that is there, simply for lack of interest or resources to help them figure that out, yet there's enough in the public domain. Others are very quick to put the responsibility somewhere else. If only governments would function, if consumers would be willing to pay for that, if my competitors would do it. So I think the main ingredient, let's not deny that, is actually human willpower. I personally believe that it would be nice to have more technology and innovation, no doubt about it. If we would have more cost competitive hydrogen or battery storage or synthetic fuels and all the other things would help. But that's an excuse. I think for most of the issues that we need to solve today, the food security issues, the deforestation issues, the inclusion issues, the educational issues, we have the answers. We know how to make it work for part of the population, but we continuously exclude others. And in any system where too many people feel they're not participating or excluded will ultimately rebel against itself. So ingredient number one is human willpower. Do we really care? And are we really aware? And are we really willing to engage? So that's a question for each and everybody individually to answer. The second thing is that I personally believe in the goodness of people. I don't believe there are many CEOs who want more unemployment, more air pollution, or more people going to bed hungry. But collectively, we're not able to deliver. And the reason for that is that we're operating within the forest and don't spend enough time anymore on the forest. Within the forest is reactive to the symptoms that we need to treat. Working on the forest is to correct the underlying causes. Politics has become very short, 3-month cycles, probably at best, and very reactionary. And business is under enormous pressure to perform short term, as you've alluded to before as well. If we don't create that space individually and collectively to address these issues, which go well beyond the quarterly reporting cycles, we will never get there. The third limitation, very briefly, is obviously measurements. We still live in a system that we treasure what we measure, where often the financial market directs capital to something that can assess the risk and measure the returns. And that is still a very gray field where progress, frankly, has been too slow. One final point on the boundaries. If we don't change the boundaries, then it's very difficult to change our collective behavior. As I mentioned before, if we believe in the goodness of people, why are they then collectively behaving the way they are? If I would, in Unilever, reward all of our salespeople on the number of orders they would write, I will get a lot of orders, but they will be very small. And that is their reward system. If I would reward them on customer service, they would behave differently. Right now, we're living in a world where our reward system was designed when finance was scarce and materials or natural capital was abundant. Now finance is abundant and our resources are scarce and our system hasn't adjusted. So we need to work on these broader system changes, and that can only be done collectively, especially at the moment that governance isn't quite functioning. And this is an opportunity for business to step up. How do we move the financial markets to the longer term? How do we accelerate the decarbonization of our global economy? How do we move not only to a circular economy, but actually a regenerative economy? How do we redesign our tax systems and our corporate systems to make it more inclusive, not just for the few living on these islands of prosperity, but for the many in the oceans of poverty? These are major fundamental system changes that require us to work at a different level together than we're currently doing. And this is one of the areas why I created Imagine as a foundation, to start to work at that. Because I believe, frankly, that CEOs themselves are held to higher standards by society at large than they're actually able to deliver on themselves. No CEO can solve the issues of plastic in the oceans, or can solve the issue of the destruction on the way we provide food to our people, or the issues of air pollution. So collective action is the main thing, and that is missing. And it is missing because the question I've asked you before, do we really care?
Okay, so we need the will, we need to create the space, we need the leadership. But who are the leaders who should be doing this? You know, if you're saying, well, actually CEOs can't do it, who
can do it alone?
Who are you looking to take that leadership?
Colin, I believe obviously that the challenges are so big that you want to have everybody work together. Democracies can only function long term if you have a functioning government system, a functioning and participating civil society, and a functioning private sector. More importantly, a private sector that is dealing with not only the financial capital, but also the social and environmental capital. These are the conditions for a fair and just system. These are the conditions to create a sustainable and resilient economy. And these are the conditions of solidarity that are needed to handle these enormous problems. But we have to recognize the realities of the world. The reality of the world is global governance doesn't work. We are not getting to the issues of cybersecurity, financial markets, climate change, and now the COVID crisis in a coordinated way. In fact, I would argue that the black swan was not the COVID crisis. We've had viruses every 3 to 4 years, SARS, Ebola, Zika, and many others, as we keep destroying our planetary boundaries and have an encroachment of the wild animal life on the human life. And that's why you get these zoonotic diseases that we are now facing. The real black swan was the inability of governments globally to coordinate a response to the healthcare to save lives, which has become a political matter in many countries, and to the joint response in PPE materials and healthcare and making these markets function. This is a global issue that cannot be solved by any individual country. And yet again, we see very dysfunctional behavior in the race to find a vaccine and making it available to your electorate. So if that is the reality, this 4-0, as Ian Bremmer calls it, then I'm just advocating that the part of society that has benefited most from good governance and the globalization, which is the business sector, steps in and fills that void, not alone, but takes the initiative. And it doesn't need everybody. I recognize that there are many in the business community scrambling to survive. I also recognize that there are, frankly, a group of people that don't care and look after their own interest. But I do believe that we now see a critical mass of 20-25% in each industry of responsible leaders, and you mentioned Satya Nadella as an example of that, that are actually willing and able to come together to take these bolder decisions, help de-risk the political process, and together with civil society and governments, move us in the right direction. A good example of that, not to be abstract, is the Green Deal in Europe, where actually many of the businesses have lobbied not only to make the rescue packages that are now being put out conditional, so that we get to a greener and more inclusive economy, but also to ensure that we have a proper policy around biodiversity, farm to fork, that we actually increase the commitments to the Paris agreements versus where Europe is right now, which is already fairly aggressive versus other parts of the world, but clearly not enough. And we're seeing business actively reassuring the politicians that it's actually better for business and better for the economy. So this dichotomy of I need to create jobs and grow the economy so I can't do climate change or take care of the other issues, I think that has been broken. Unless we attack the issues like climate change and inequality, unless we attack them, will we not be able to grow our economies? And that correlation is now clear. When I started at Unilever 10, 12 years ago, it was probably a little bit more of an act of faith and data were not available. But now we have overwhelming data available that companies that decarbonize their value chain are more robust and tend to have a better performance. Companies that put purpose at their core have a higher engaged workforce, tend to have a better performance. Companies that are more diverse in their management have a better financial performance. So I think slowly the financial market is waking up. And if we can create these tipping points across these industry sectors, but especially in the financial market, then I think we could accelerate and speed and scale and have a chance to avoid further costly disasters like we're now going through.
So, as I understand it, what you're saying is we need inspirational leaders within different sectors to work together in a cooperative fashion and to work together with people in the different investment businesses to bring about this change. Is that correct?
This is absolutely correct. We have put 27, again, examples are always better. We've put 27 CEOs together in the food sector. Our food system is broken. It accounts for 20% of climate change. That's where you find most of the poverty. Smallholder farmers are monocrop farmers, often stunted. That's where you find child labor or slave labor. On the other hand, obesity and the health issues. And that's where deforestation comes in and all the other things. Our food system is broken. Now we've put a whole value chain together, which means the fertilizer producers to the seed producers, to the traders, to the producers, to the retailers, to the manufacturers. And because we put a whole value chain together, we can, in all honesty, get to issues like carbon positive farming, like livelihoods for smallholder farmers, holistically solving issues like the food security issues in Africa that we are now having to deal with, or effectively implementing the Green Deal. It is that critical mass of responsible people that set the bar higher continuously, that might be courageous individually, but collectively become more courageous, that is going to be a key engine of change to attack some of these fundamental issues that I talked about. Not alone, has to be done ultimately in partnership with civil society and the governments. But I'm advocating very strongly that it is now in businesses' interest, but also an enormous opportunity to fill that void. Business that understands that and does that, tries to strive to a positive impact model, will be so much more the better off for it. The Sustainable Development Agenda, as I call it, is probably one of the most profitable business agendas that is out there at a time when we need it most. It also happens to be an agenda that is also creating more jobs, better jobs, and more resilient jobs. So if we can solve the issues of the environmental challenges as well as the social challenges at the same time, it leads you study after study, evidence after evidence, to accelerating the move to a greener economy.
Now, we've got a lot of movements that are working in this space, trying to bring about the type of change that you're talking about. What do you think can be done to make those movements more effective collectively?
Well, that's a very good question, Colin. It is when issues become apparent, and many of these issues have crept up towards faster than our collective consciousness was aware. But what you then see is 1,000 flowers are blooming. The many initiatives that are there to decarbonize global economies, local, regional communities, across industry sectors, driving consumer behavior, government policy, forcing companies to step up and be more aggressive, are enormous. And to some extent, that is good. But now we're at the moment to aggregate, not disaggregate. So trying to put these flowers together, I would say, and making a nice bouquet out of it is absolutely important. Convergence versus divergence. And there is a little bit of a challenge because with the enormous amounts of NGOs out there, high net worth individuals that like to spend their money behind their causes, we've actually seen a lot of efforts going on that are not orchestrated and coordinated. So, for example, what we are focused on increasingly is to create these coalitions at scale to drive these transformative changes. We've done it with Gavi, which is a good example. We're doing it now again with the Alliance for Vaccines for COVID, which is hopefully helping especially the emerging markets. We're doing it with education, where we have the education fund now that is raising funds to ensure that everybody can be in education and stay in education. There are some examples of where it is done collectively very well. That's why we've created business alliances like We Mean Business or Imperative 21, that is trying to see on how we can move our economic systems. And the economics of mutuality that you've been with Bruno such a big champion about is probably also the glue that can put us together. That's why I'm so happy that you have this seminar. I believe that schools that are in the foreground, like the Saïd Business School, can be a magnet for this objective, neutral ground where we can bring these stakeholders together and where we drive these solutions based on facts, based on science, based on honest and open discussions, and not regrettably what is currently happening based on politics and short-term interests.
You mentioned measurement earlier on as being very important in this area. What would you regard as being the main improvements that can and should be made to the way in which we measure performance?
Well, what is very clear is, and Bruno alluded to it already, if you go back about 50, 60 years, 85% of the value of a corporation you could measure by tangible assets, and that's how our accounting system has been created. Unfortunately, with the move to a service economy, with valuing increasingly this intellectual capital, social capital that we haven't been able to quantify, we now see that our current accounting system only measures about 15% of the value. Makes it also very difficult for the financial community to get behind this and move this forward. So under the principle that you cannot boil the ocean at once or eat the elephant in one bite, we have to go step by step. If the most burning issue right now is climate change and inequality, I would argue let's focus on that. On climate change, we now have the Task Force for Financial Disclosure that has over $100 trillion of assets under management behind it, and where we clearly talk about disclosing the risk of carbon in your value chain, not only in your own operations, scope 3 included, in your value chain, where we base our actions on science-based targets, and ideally where we get to a price on carbon. That is very much supported as well by the financial industry, which is increasingly seeing the risks and the downsides, but also increasingly the opportunities. And that's very clear during COVID once more, when it gets to the financial performance of the fossil fuel industry versus the green energy as an example. So the same thing on the social side. The social dimension has frankly been neglected. There have been some aborted attempts to look at salary scales across gender or to look at some racial data, but frankly, we have never pursued that actively. I think that COVID has, again, brought more to the foreground the importance of your employees, of the people that are into your value chain, and I hope that we quickly come with measures that not only measure the shortcomings, but drive this juster transition that we're all looking for. So I would focus on those two areas first, and I would encourage organizations like SASB, the Sustainable Accounting Standard Board, or Accounting for Sustainability, or the GRI, or many of the initiatives that are out there, the World Business Council was redefining natural and social capital, to really get together, to put your own interests aside and create a common standard. I'm very encouraged by the WEF having taken up with the International Business Council, also the challenge of working with the 4 big accounting firms who have been frankly absent from this debate for way too long, into coming up with some measures. But let's put that together and let's see if we can accelerate it in the near future. The good thing is now that the European government, which will increasingly be a standard setter across the world, I believe, in the absence of the US having abdicated their responsibilities and China not frankly being ready. So putting our bets on to Europe and helping them continue to transform their accounting system, forcing companies to put purpose in the middle, forcing companies to consider long-term operations as the modus operandi and not the exception, and starting to introduce these measures around climate and social inequality especially, would be a major step forward.
In just a few minutes, I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. So if anyone wants to raise a question with Paul, could you please do it in the Q&A function on Zoom, and then we'll pick those up in just a few minutes. Could I just, Paul, turn to, you mentioned business schools and business education.
Yeah, absolutely.
What do you think needs to change in terms of business school education?
Well, the business schools are such an important part, and unfortunately, they've been excluded from too many discussions. If you look at the business community, the academic community, it still has the highest level of trust. That's a very important asset that we now need as we bring these transformational partnerships together. It also is often the roots of science-based discussions versus emotional judgments, and that's very valuable as well. And then they have a clear role to play to obviously develop the moral leaders of the future in this multi-stakeholder environment that we're all aspiring to live in. If you look at the future of education, I think there are a few points that should not be a surprise into the way that we should transform education. And the Saïd Business School, with leaders like yourselves, Bob Beckles, Peter Tuvano, and many others, is actually at the foreground of this, I believe. And that's why I'm honored to be able to chair the board of the school. But the first thing is, you need to be sure in this environment now that we all become digitally resilient. That's not an easy thing to do, as we've all discovered. I have one of my sons still in higher education, and every university struggles with that. The second thing is we need to make higher education inclusive. We've fallen terribly short in most of the elite colleges that we aspire to be part of in terms of creating the racial and the gender equality that we need. So let's make those two conditions as a given. I also think that with the current change of education, that we need to create these different leaders. The MBAs have too long been cherishing, if I can use that word, or celebrating the shareholder capitalism. And that's frankly the model that most of the MBA schools are still teaching. The benefit that Saïd has and some other schools is that you
think we may have been experiencing a.
we're experiencing a problem.
Yep. I think
Am I cut out or the rest?
You're back again, Paul, so just keep going.
Sorry, I apologize for that, but I was talking, I don't know where I lost you, Colin, but I was talking about digitally resilient. I was talking about inclusive, and I was talking to my third point that you need to create these multidisciplinary leaders, and that the Saïd Business School and Oxford have a wonderful opportunity to tap into that with the Blatnick School, with the Smith School, and many other things, so that we create these system thinkers that can work on these transformative partnerships with these other stakeholders that we're talking about. And then last but not least, I think the dimension of lifelong learning is going to be incredibly important, just simply with the pace of change that we have right now. It's just too fast to think that we can produce the end product that is needed in only a 1-year MBA. And this is obviously a wonderful opportunity. And that's just on the educational side. Then on the academic and the research side, people like yourselves, your book Prosperity has had an enormous influence and is actually changing the face of many businesses. And I encounter that every day. So quality academic research and being on the foreground of that thinking. And also as a university, having that courage to participate in some of these broader transformational changes is the other opportunity that I very much think the business schools of the future need to think about.
And if you were advising one of our business school students on what they should be focusing on and seeking to do, what would your advice to them be?
For the students itself, Colin?
Yes, for the students themselves.
Well, obviously, if you, and I've actually talked to many of the students in Saïd and also in some of the other universities I'm connected to. First of all, it's a wonderful moment in your lives. Many of you are below 30. That's about half the world population. It's not easy. Young people are now settled up with higher levels of debt again, with challenging job markets that they were not wishing for. Many of them have been excluded from education for the last 6 to 9 months. 1 out of 4 of the young people in this world still live in zones of violence or conflict. So it's not easy to be young, and I have a lot of respect for that. But you have to demand a seat at the table, and you have to be there. First of all, be very aware of what is happening, adjust your own lifestyle accordingly, and then use your powers to influence others. With the businesses you think to create, social enterprises are increasingly important. B Corp movement is an example of that. I would call that part of a social enterprise thinking, and start to create these new models. You are more digitally savvy, you are more connected, you are more open to alternative business models. So you're very well placed to not only have a seat at the table, but actually take the table and drive these changes. And I would encourage you to do that. And then the last point, I would not disregard your obligations that you have to vote in the political system. We are ending up with things like Brexit or the US situation because the young people, unfortunately, were absent of the polls. So do exercise the right that is given to you by birth and become part of a political process so that we can get also the leaders that we ultimately need at the governmental level to implement the broader rules, laws, and regulations. Otherwise, we simply won't get there.
And finally, just before I open it up to questions, could you just tell us what would you like to leave as your lasting legacy in this area?
Well, I actually have always been a little bit against the question like the CEOs always ask. When I was there 10 years, what do you want your legacy to be? And I've seen so many CEOs making the wrong shorter term decisions to go out with a great legacy that then backfires over time. I just hope that we can all contribute to changing the face of business, to showing that a multi-stakeholder, longer-term business model is actually a more profitable model for the shareholders as well, but ultimately also optimizes the return for all the other stakeholders. I'm saying not the same returns, we have different needs, but it should optimize the return for all of our stakeholders. I think it's totally possible. We tried to do that on Unilever. We put ourselves on that trajectory. By no means finished, but we had a 300% shareholder return over that period of time, whilst we were decoupling our growth from environmental impact, whilst we were increasing our overall social impact, whilst we were issuing and implementing the social, the human rights reports and all the other things. That is good business now. And the reason it is good business now is that the cost of not acting is already becoming significantly higher than the cost of acting. If people would really understand that and spend some time studying that for whatever area of interest of these sustainable development goals your business model would lead you to, you will see the enormous opportunities that can be unlocked. So I hope we're going to bend the curve of capitalism. I've never been as intellectual to participate in the discussions around the word of capitalism, but I do actively agree that we need to bend the curve of capitalism and to make it more equitable, more inclusive, and more sustainable. Not different from what Franklin Roosevelt did in the 30s when he came up with a New Deal in the US and a period of enormous prosperity was unlocked. This is our moment to seize that. We're really at the intersection of deciding what future we want. I personally am of the opinion that there is only one direction, that the other direction doesn't lead to a future. But it's up to us now to take that decision. Do we want a greener, more inclusive, more multi-generational, more sustainable future? Or do we continue to want to walk the current path and deal with pandemics on steroids every 5 or 10 years? It's not going to be a pretty picture, especially from the starting point that we are now. So we don't have a choice. And I hope that we can achieve this transformation now in the 10 years that we have left for the Sustainable Development Goals. It's by all means doable, by all means doable.
Well, we've got a huge number of questions that have come in. You've really stimulated a lot of comment. I'll just pick up on a few of them. One from Duncan McCulloch, who's GM of Mars for Middle East and Africa. Making some of these changes will have significant costs on businesses. Will consumers pay for this additional value that we create?
Well, there are some issues that cost money, and there are some things that actually are cheaper. Increasingly, we see things that are cheaper, and they're obviously easier to implement. In 70–80% of the world, green energy is already cheaper than fossil fuel. It's also cheaper to have sustainable sourcing and higher yield. It's also proven that it's actually cheaper to have a more engaged workforce, a more diverse workforce, pay them well, treat them well, than it is to just treat them like lemons. So there are many things, I think, in the models that we've talked about that we can do today. But I recognize that there might be some areas that you cannot all solve either by yourself, or the economics might not get you there. In that case, you need to actively work first and foremost on partnerships and see if that unlocks possibilities. And then you need to actually work on ensuring that governments put the right frameworks in place. I don't think personally that business can solve the issue of plastics and plastics in the ocean. It would be incredibly costly. And frankly, the economic system is driving you in the wrong direction. But nothing prevents companies to go together and to ensure that governments put the right frameworks in place that actually tip this economic balance. So all these issues over time can be addressed, but some of them need to be spaced out. But a very simple question. Many businesses are willing to build factories that only pay out after 5 or 10 years or sometimes longer. Many businesses are willing to invest in IT systems that might pay out in 10, 15 years. Businesses are investing in people that sometimes only pay out in 25, 30 years, as you need the best CEO. Why would we continue to have a discussion on making investments in the future of humanity? It's the essence of ensuring that our businesses will be around long term. And like any business person like any GM, like yourself in a wonderful job in Mars, has to make choices of investments, I hope that the planet is one of your stakeholders. And I hope as you balance these choices that you make, that you also think of other stakeholders than only the shareholders. Working for Mars, I know you do. In order to balance that, because you cannot satisfy everybody all the time, it actually calls for that reason to move to a longer term business model. You've deliberately chosen in Mars with your Farmers Income Lab to improve the livelihood of smallholder farmers. That's a smart thing because it directly relates to increasing the yield. You've also chosen to make it more inclusive and get women there. That's a smart thing because investing in women gives you twice the payout as in men. You've also decided to push for circularity in your packaging. It's a smart thing because consumers otherwise wouldn't buy you anymore. And soon you'll discover it's actually cheaper. So with an intention of urgency and speed, start attacking these issues first and be sure that you don't just tick the box and say, my company has done it. Be sure that first and foremost, you go to this more overall positive business model, but that you also become an active part of driving these transformative changes in the system. I believe that the only companies that are going to survive long term and that will be rewarded are the companies that not only look after their own shop, even if it's responsible, but companies that have a positive impact, net positive, and are actively participating in driving these sometimes tougher transformative changes.
So another question says, in the midst of such political, health, and economic uncertainty, what will spark a pivot in the directions you're discussing when the pressures seem to be more on pulling back to even more short-term financial outcomes?
I think that the US election, if I'm very short and very direct here, I think the US election is going to be pivotal. There will be a fundamental difference if there is a change of president or a continuation of the current presidency. The US still is a moral force. I don't think it has lost it. There's some trust has been lost now. But at the same time, if we get the right government in there, we can really accelerate some of the changes, especially again around climate change, and reverse some of these devastating laws that have come down. And that's a pivot that we should focus on. The second pivot really is COVID itself. We have invested currently $12 trillion in our global economies just to stabilize, to save lives and livelihoods. We're going to spend at least another $10 trillion if we want to come out of this in a reasonable way. And how we spend that money is going to be decisive. Europe has already dedicated about 30% of its spending to greening the economy. We need to obviously up that. So initiating that political momentum for spending more money now behind this green conversion is an opportunity we don't want to let go. The third pivot, I think at the end of the day, that CEOs will be very sensitive towards is the voice of their employees. Obviously the voice of their families and their children, but the voice of their employees. For the first time now, we see Greta Thunberg in every company. And we see people walking out because they're delivering mattresses to the borders where Mexicans are separated from their children, because they do face recognition with the US government, because they are not aggressive enough on climate change. Employees are starting to speak out. In the past, they would just go and work for another company. Now they're willing to hold their management to accountability. And 78% or 80%, according to Edelman, of the employees in their companies expect, not only ask or demand, expect their CEOs to be part of these transformative changes. When you are in a position like a CEO, you very simply are amongst the very few fortunate people in society. You probably were educated. You can be free where you want to work and live. You made it past the age of 5 because you had sanitation. You're not stunted because you got good food. Well, you won the lottery ticket of life. What did you do for that? Nothing. You are just a lucky guy like I was. And mostly we are guys still, unfortunately. Well, if you are that lucky and you find yourself in that situation, like I found myself in, then it is simply our duty, our obligation to put ourselves to the service of the other 95%. And that, I hope, will be one of the major transformative changes that we will see at the corporate level. We need more leaders and trees.
We've got many more questions that I'm afraid we won't be able to take at this stage because we've run out of time, but a number of them start off by saying, Paul, thank you for your inspirational message. And I think that that's a very common reaction to what you've just said. You really have inspired the start of this forum with what you've just said. And so on behalf of everyone in this forum, I'd like to thank you most sincerely for having done that. Thank you very much indeed.
No, thank you, Colin, for what you're doing. And think about all the people that are listening. If we could just combine that into a force going in the right direction, we can move mountains. This is the moment. If there are people that have some questions that we didn't get to, I can only apologize. But if you send them to me, Colin, and we know who they are, I'll make an effort to get back to people.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that offer.
Thank you, and good luck with the rest.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your generosity, Paul, and an amazing conversation there, which will bring us right into a little bit of a deeper dive into the map that we saw at the beginning of the day today with Alistair Cullen Jones, who is going to be joining us from the Economics of Mutuality team to really help give us a visual and some additional context on some of those unique contributions that the purposeful business movements are making at this time. So Alistair, please join us.
Thank you so much, Amanda. It's a joy to be with so many of you from all around the globe. What esteemed company to follow: Paul Pullman, Colin Mayer, CBE, and Bruno Roche. Then me. I guess no pressure then, hey? So you've heard lots about the many dysfunctions present in our economic system and the urgent need for systems change. You've also seen a visual map of the complex and problematic dynamics created by the dominance of shareholder primacy in our economic system. Perhaps then you will spare me just a couple of minutes to first explain a bit more about these beautiful pictures that you keep seeing popping up. The goal of these diagnoses maps, as we're calling them, is to create shared meaning behind the big systemic issues we often discuss and debate, but perhaps still lack clarity and consistency when it comes to the many interrelated relationships and implications. Rather than through a lengthy report or a stale PowerPoint, let's be honest, we've had enough of those, we have developed interactive visual maps that maintain as much as possible the dynamic, complex nature of the issues we are interested in solving and discussing here. In Paul's words earlier, I think that this can help us work on the forest and not in the forest. Therefore, each day we'll be presenting a diagnosis of the relevant challenge being discussed, namely shareholder primacy, as you saw earlier with Colin, performance measurement tomorrow, and education and leadership on Friday. Now, before we go any further, it's worth saying that all the maps are a work in progress and that they are intended to be built on through ongoing iterations in order to benefit from the collective knowledge of other experts and practitioners. So bear in mind, they are not complete nor intended to be exhaustive in any way. In fact, following the forum, we'll be launching a feedback system so that we can incorporate all that we have missed, the new ideas and new perspectives that I hope we receive from you over the coming days. So please keep a lookout for this announcement. In addition to the diagnosis maps, we have added more layers of thinking and analysis. So the next map I will be sharing with you incorporates what we're calling the movements layer. The insights we want to reveal through this work go beyond an understanding of the activities and the key stakeholders relevant to the various movements and organizations. The goal of the movements layer is to begin to understand with whom and how existing organizations and movements are tackling the different key breakdowns related to the larger systemic diagnosis. The hope is that this can spur both reflection on progress to date and further action in establishing new collaborations and initiatives so that we don't just talk about systems change, we actually get on and do it. In producing these movement maps, we have consulted far and wide with many organizations and movements that you will see featured here. We have interviewed key members of their teams in addition to undertaking extensive desk research. We also discovered a handful of other types of maps being created by Regenerate, Imperative 21, and Lords. The map is clearly not exhaustive. I keep reiterating this. Of all the movements and organizations out there, at the current count, as Bruno said, there are at least 180 that could have been discussed. But what we have done is initiated a process of collation toward a shared understanding of the many actors that are working on economic systems change. Our focus will be on the movements and the actors that are most well known, and of course, those present on the various panels. Unsurprisingly, many actors use a combination of approaches or levers. Here we are focused on the primary approach of the movement or organization. So let's begin a walkthrough. This map is a diagnosis of the stakeholder primacy issues shared by Colin. It shows us both the scale and the complexity of the breakdowns related to shareholder primacy. Given this, it's unsurprising that there are a lot of relevant movements and organizations active in addressing these breakdowns. Let's walk through some of them via our high-level groupings. Within the first group of actors, we can see a difference in the way the breakdowns they respond to are perceived and prioritized. The Sustainable Development Goals, or global goals, already much discussed by Paul, are very broad and overlapping sets of environmental and social issues. A strength of the SDGs has been in creating a clear reference point for all the types of actors wanting to address specific problems. The OECD's Business for Inclusive Growth initiative, for example, tackles a subset of these goals with the G7 nations as its primary focus. It also focuses on creating synergies between government, business, philanthropic-led initiatives, and mobilizes leading multinationals. Imperative 21 and the Wellbeing Alliance respond to these breakdowns by homing in on the principles that govern the economic system, seeking to break the dominance of the Friedman Doctrine and the culture that it creates. In essence, these movements form nodes of activity around key goals by bringing together cross-sector collaborations to tackle them. In this next grouping, all four actors listed consider that current policy and regulation supports businesses to serve shareholders rather than society and to take a short-term view. In many cases, these policies are tied to the outdated principles and beliefs shown as system breakdowns related to shareholder primacy in this map. Policy Link and the New Economics Foundation recognize that shaping policy and regulation is out of reach for many, particularly those experiencing exclusion. Both emphasize the importance and the voice of people closest to the challenges, including local groups and campaigners, and aim to contribute to a more just and democratic economy. The Purposeful Company and Business Roundtable in the UK and US respectively recognize the power and responsibility of business leaders in influencing policy. They draw CEOs and businesses together into a task force or association to focus on shaping public policy. A key difference, however, is that the Purposeful Company is not a membership organization made up of CEOs or even businesses themselves. It is a task force convened by the Bank of England. Indeed, while there is broad alignment on the big picture of systems change within this grouping, there are some necessary reforms that would perhaps not be welcomed by all members of a CEO or business-only interest group. The breakdown noted here and mentioned by Paul on international corporate taxation is an issue that, while widely recognized, does not get the same attention as other breakdowns on the map. But with an estimated 200 billion a year in lost tax revenues, according to the World Economic Forum, this situation urgently needs to change. In the next group, A Blueprint for Better Business, Chief Executives for Corporate Purpose, and the B Team all point to the deep flaws in the current economic system. Notably, they focus on the relationship between investors and CEOs as a key problem to respond to. Conscious capitalism builds and supports a global network of businesses dedicated to growth through conscious leadership. The conscious culture puts individuals and people over products and services and forms one of conscious capitalism's 4 pillars. Bringing CEOs together enables them to learn from each other and build on their purpose and stakeholder orientation. We will be returning to this grouping in much more detail on day 3. The key difference between this next grouping and the previous one is at the level of engagement. Strategy and advisory services are often focused at the business unit level of large multinationals, although CEO and senior leadership buy-in is ideally gained. Due to the potential impact multinationals can have, there is a clear strategy amongst the organizations to prioritize engaging them despite the application of the ideas and methodologies being intended for business more broadly. While Economics of Mutuality Solutions, FSG, Donut Economics Action Lab use consultancy models to deliver defined projects, executive education also plays an important supporting role. EOM, for example, run executive training days at the point of initiating a new consultancy engagement. FSG, particularly through their shared value initiative, offer one of the most well-known approaches to identifying win-win scenarios of profit and social impact, and have been highly influential in bringing social impact consulting into the day-to-day thinking of multinationals. Business for Social Responsibility and Sustainability are two of the longest-standing advisory players in the space, offering a blend of consulting, research, and members' activities. Both want to see sustainability embedded in core business. Interestingly, however, the newer players, by contrast, see their role more in terms of business transformation, impact, and purpose-led strategy. Similarly to the many actors in the previous two groups, B-Lab encourage better business behaviors, but take a company certification approach, assessing and certifying companies as B Corps and creating communities to share best practices. B-Lab also connects into policy deficiencies by allowing companies to voluntarily commit to higher governance standards while simultaneously pushing legislative changes to enable new corporate structures. This very quick, again, non-exhaustive tour of breakdowns and movements, I think raises at least a couple of related talking points ahead of our panel. First, organizations such as PolicyLink play an important role in the ecosystem, but can be somewhat overlooked in business-dominated conversations about systems transformation. The comparative lack of activity on policy reform, as you saw on the map, is most stark when placed next to the increasing number of organizations and initiatives, all seeking CEO and/or business leader attention, just at a moment when their time is increasingly stretched. While large multinationals can engage in multiple initiatives, it still creates some confusion among internal stakeholders that can have several small transformation projects with different organizations across their business units. So it merits asking if more creative bottom-up strategies for engaging corporations are required, and how fellow organizations seeking systems change can better integrate and collaborate on projects with the same type of corporate client. Perhaps this is what Paul is suggesting in his earlier image of creating a bouquet of flowers from the many thousands. Second, with so much attention on CEOs and business leaders and the energy being given to supporting and engaging them, what are we learning about their ability to actually drive organizational transformation, especially as it relates to the key breakdowns of constantly changing, disconnected and distant ownership of publicly listed companies? Please take the time to explore the maps on your own. The link can be found in the virtual event space, and please feel free to reach out to me and ask any questions of myself or the colleagues that have worked so hard on this mapping process together. You can find them on Umbrella. Her name's Laura Ketteringham and JJ van der Wijf. But now over to you, Amanda, to hear from our amazing panel.
Thank you so much, Alistair. And I think that map is going to be put to very good use by everyone that's at this forum and others. So thank you for sharing it with us and giving us a preview of what we'll be talking about on our panel. If everyone can bear with us for a moment, we are going to have a brief pause while we bring all of our panelists onto the line, and we will get started in about 60 seconds. And welcome back, everyone. Thanks for bearing with us during that momentary pause. I would like to welcome a number of esteemed colleagues to a panel discussion next up. We are going to be using some of the context from the earlier part of the day and the map that Alistair just shared with us to talk about some of the unique contributions of those leading purposeful business movements in enacting systemic business transformation. So what we're going to do is start off with a brief introduction and invite each of the panelists to share their perspective on this question, and then we'll move into a dynamic conversation from there. So I'm going to start off by introducing Mark Fitzer. He is the Managing Director at FSG and the Creating Shared Value Initiative. His work on shared value has been featured in Harvard Business Review and has played a key role in the development and adoption of the concept gradually. There have been corporations, foundations, and nonprofits that have been guided by Mark that have helped save lives, improve livelihoods, and protect natural resources. He has 25 years of experience as an advisor to executives in the private and social sector to help surface new insights and collaborative efforts against our global challenges. Welcome, Mark. We'd love to get your perspective on this question.
Thanks, Amanda. Hi, everyone. Sorry we are virtual, and I hope you're all okay. I'd like to do three things very briefly as the invited representative of the shared value movement, and thinking of the bouquet, I put shared value very much in parentheses. First, to give you a quick sense of the core shared value ideas. Second, reflect on where the shared value push came short, and I think where we need to do much, much better. And third, dig deeper into what I see as the triangle of transformation. It may turn into a square by the end of this conference, listening to Bruno and Colin. But here are the key areas that we need to tackle more than ever today, as we see with COVID, and as Bruno and Paul mentioned, how fragile and inequitable our social and market systems are. So to the first point on shared value, some core ideas where I think many of us have converged by now. A core idea is that business and society are not just in trade-off, but really codependent. What Bruno calls mutuality with his whole team and with Colin. And if that's true, then seeing social problems only as a drag on profit is just short-sighted, just wrong. And connected to that notion that codependence is that codependence is really specific to each company and its context. And that there are unique opportunities for each business to contribute. And that's because shared value is realized in three ways. By one, rethinking products and their impacts. Two, reconfiguring value chain activities to increase their net positive footprint. And three, and that's the often neglected one, by investing in market conditions that lift the specific social constraints on a company's activities. And another core idea of the shared value sort of push, which we grew into, is that there are degrees of possibilities, from isolated innovations within companies to the next degree, seeing the entire company as the shared value engine, like the B Corp movement, to ultimately actually seeing the company and the market systems as the realm of change. It's not that helpful, for example, to be a healthcare innovator in a failing health system. You have an interest in improving the system to realize the full potential of your own proposition. So by some measures, shared value did nudge over the years. Recently, an investor sent us a list of 500 companies they track that use the shared value management framework. But to my second point, I think as shared value godparents, I think we've come short. We could have done better. I think by focusing purely on the opportunities over the years, we sort of put the negative impacts aside too much. And I think we see this much better now, that products and activities can be reimagined to have more positive impact, but they always drag legacy and new negative impacts along. And purpose-driven organizations need to see and manage all of these complex linkages. Then by championing innovations, we gave way too much leeway to legacy activities that remain unchanged. And we really need now to, with a purpose mindset, we'll come back to it, look at the purpose positive stuff, the purpose negative stuff, in relation perhaps to the purpose neutral stuff in a business, and really steer the entire portfolio. And by linking the purpose-driven companies to new market systems, we are trying to make transformation more collaborative, more connected to the realities of underserved and vulnerable customers, employees, communities of operation, building on our work on collective impact and shaping inclusive markets. But frankly, we're far from getting there. Too common are companies joining partnerships and platforms that fly way too high to improve actually the local market system conditions. Rare still is the company that's both willing to resource systems change and at the same time share and relinquish control to stakeholders in the system to find solutions. And I'm really glad that Paul flagged his work in food systems, and I'm sure Michael actually will talk more about these dynamics. Yeah. Which gets me to the third and final point, this transformation triangle, or perhaps square, I mentioned earlier, which has the purpose-based company as the key driver of change. We heard that already. Guided by new performance measurement and accounting practices, we heard that. What we would put in the third corner is focus not just on their business, but working really to shape more inclusive and green market systems. So the triangle is really purpose, measurement, accounting, and market systems. And briefly on these, the purpose-based companies is of course essential. We're all there, but actually purpose is really both potential and painful. It's not realized unless it permeates every major activity, every revenue cost side decision, capital allocation decision, in sync with ambitious impact targets. And there's still a ton of work for companies to see it and truly act on it. At the Shared Value Initiative, we've just put out a purpose playbook to try to help and nudge in that direction. And then there's new forms of measurement and accounting. And yes, there's tons of noise and tons of confusion, competing theories of change. Bruno mentioned it. And we think, there's monetizing all impacts, which is very big, which would be a great end state, but we know how getting there is so very tough. And another one that we are working on is hybrid metrics and measurement, which actually Mark Kramer, my colleague, is addressing today with a new article in Institutional Investor, and tomorrow in a webinar, and that's where we're focusing our attention and we're learning. And that's basically what that does is put distinct portion of revenue and expenses in relationship with core impacts they create, which allows you to understand how investment decisions across the business can simultaneously affect financial and societal outcomes. And that's really key for investors as well. And then there's the market system corner, and I'll stop where some companies, far too few, are being much better at having a system strategy. They're thinking through which systems matter most and where, whether it's on supply side outcomes or whether it's the system that governed their new product introduction and so on. And then they're better at pivoting from control to empowering system actors to see the value of change and evolve it in ways that gets us to more equitable and regenerative outcomes. So each of these is hugely complex. I'm glad this conference is going to focus on all these topics. And I'm certainly here also as a learner and really look forward to that. Back to you, Amanda.
Thank you so much, Mark. And I love that the triangle may already be turning into a square. So we are continuing the learning and the innovations right here live together. So next, I'd like to invite Rebecca Henderson to join us. She's the John and Natty MacArthur University professor at Harvard University. She is a prominent economist and influential professor, and her work is really focused on driving that large-scale change that we're talking about. As a leading authority in organizational and strategic change for more than 30 years, today, her research, teaching, and speaking all centers on purpose-driven capitalism and the role that business leaders at every level can play in reimagining our current system. Right now, she's teaching the course at the MBA program called Reimagining Capitalism, and she recently released a new book called Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. So lots of new readings for us as well here. Rebecca, we'd love to invite you and your contribution to the conversation.
Amanda, thank you very much. And I really enjoyed Paul's remarks, as always. And Mark, it's so exciting to hear you talk about the need for companies to focus on systemic market conditions. I really underline that as central to where we need to go. What I thought I would focus on very briefly this morning, though, is my own research into the drivers of purpose and performance. Particularly in a group like this, we tend to take for granted that, of course, purpose is a great thing. Of course, it's going to be very important. I'd like to remind us of just how strong the research underpinning is of this belief. And I base my remarks on 20 years as the Eastman Kodak professor at MIT, where I was studying firms like Kodak. That was a coincidence, but I was studying firms like Kodak, like Nokia, like General Motors, that were trying to change and do things differently. And I think that's the moment we're in right now. We have firms that see they need to act in new ways, that they need to create shared value, but it's tough. As Mark said, it's tough, it's a long road, people will tell you it's not going to work and that it's not happening. What do we know about how to help firms through that transition? And what I think I learned in all those years of work and has since deepened is that purpose is an incredible tool to have in your arsenal if you're trying to do new things. And I'll start with one of the statistics that still stuns me, and I've known it for 15 years, and it is this. In the average industry, that is in every industry worldwide, on average, the top 10% of firms, the highest 10% of firms, the best performing 10%, are twice as productive as the lowest 10% performing firms. So with the same capital, the same inputs, the same labor, they are producing twice as much. I know it seems incredible. When this finding first emerged in economics, there was, I think, a furor is a polite way of saying there was a fight. Like nobody could believe it. I spent 20 years in windowless conference rooms trying to make it go away. Everyone thought we have to control better. It must be some difference in the capital. It must be some difference in the employees. It must be some difference in the background of the managers, blah, 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 blah. No, it's very hard to make this result go away. And it seems to be driven by, big surprise, differences in management practices. This drives the economists crazy. Like, you mean what managers actually do really makes a big difference? Yes, it really does. John Van Reenen and Nicholas Bloom, who I think will probably win the Nobel Prize for this work, did a years-long study across tens of thousands of companies, looking at their management practices and their outcome and showing, I think, quite conclusively that what made firms more productive was having better management practices. Now, for those of us who've worked with firms or work in organizational behavior or IR, this will be like a duh. Toyota is better managed. What are the better management practices? High levels of communication, high levels of strategic alignment, high levels of trust, genuine authenticity, real devolution of power. That's what makes a firm productive and innovative. And we now have hundreds of studies from behavioral economics, from social psychology, showing the way in which the adoption of an authentic purpose increases strategic alignment, increases intrinsic motivation, increases empowerment and sense of meaning, increases authenticity, that together raise levels of trust and engagement in ways that make firms significantly better places to work and significantly more successful. I think it's important to remember that purpose is not a ticket to outsize financial returns. You know, sometimes people want me to say, oh, well, I just adopt a purpose and hey, everything will be great. No, for two reasons. The first is you can't just announce you're adopting a purpose. I'm a strategy professor. Anything you could do instantaneously is not going to have high returns. Purpose is something you build gradually over time, a commitment to doing the right thing, to looking more broadly, to treating your employees with dignity and respect. And that takes time. It takes time for people to believe you. It takes time to make the investments, the costly commitments that persuade the people in your firm and in your ecosystem that you really are for real. But if you can make those investments, it gives you the opportunity to do things that your competitors cannot. So no instantaneous link to profit, but a long road that gives you the opportunity to do well. No instantaneous link to profit because, and I don't think anyone will find this surprising, if you merely talk about purpose in general terms and it's not connected to your strategy, it goes nowhere. It has to be right through the central strategy of the organization. And last but not least, being purpose-driven is expensive. If you say that you have a purpose greater than simply making money, and yet everything you do maximizes short-term returns, no one will believe you have a greater purpose. The only way to persuade people that you have a purpose beyond making money is for sometimes to spend resources or time or energy doing something that isn't immediately profitable. So I'm not surprised when we look at some of the large-scale studies of, do firms that outperform on ESG outperform financially? You know, for many years we saw a wash. Why? Well, partly because the ESG metrics weren't very good, and partly because there can be purpose-driven firms that are surviving and thriving, but they're not outperforming. What they're doing is changing the industry, creating much better environment for their employees, modeling new ways of behaving that I think provide a fantastic platform for changing the system in just the way that Mark talked about.
Thank you so much.
Let me conclude. Purpose is real. It's in the data. It's in the research. And I think we have very good reasons for believing that purpose-driven firms can pioneer the change we need and can indeed change the broader system. Thank you.
Thank you. And picking up on your theme about the road to opportunity, I want to welcome Michael McAfee, the CEO of Policy Link, as our next panelist. Michael has a deep devotion to serving the nation's most underserved populations. He played a leadership role in securing Promise Neighborhoods as a permanent federal program and led efforts to improve outcomes for more than 300,000 children and facilitated the investment of billions of dollars in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty. He's the catalyst for new and growing body of work, corporate racial equity. And that includes the first comprehensive tool to guide private sector companies in assessing and actively promoting equity in every aspect of their company's value chain. So Michael, welcome to the conversation. We'd love to hear your contribution to this topic.
Thank you. And Rebecca and Mark, thank you for your remarks. They gave me a lot of energy as I was listening to what you all were saying. And they gave me a lot of energy for a couple of reasons. The first is, even in the opening remarks of this conference, there seems to be a source of truth that the way we have structured our economy doesn't work for the vast majority of people. And it's really refreshing to join a space where we're not debating that, but we're humbly trying to figure out, how do we move from making that acknowledgement to actually creating something that does work better? And so I want to stay on this point of purpose that Rebecca talked about, and I want to stay on the point of systems that Mark talked about, because I think they're fundamentally important. And I just want to share some reflections of things that we're learning as we're entering into this corporate space and from the work that we've done over the last 20 years to create a just and fair society. And the first thing, as I'm thinking about the pillars of the economics of mutuality, is this. Think about, who are the people that are centered when you think about the design of an economy? Because I find when we're trying to deal with systems challenges, when we don't figure out explicitly upfront who we've centered, we will often miss the mark. And we continuously see this happen in the United States. One, because we will not talk about race, but also because we've intentionally designed a system that is to be oppressive, and we won't acknowledge that either. And so you see this happening over and over again. Most recently with how we tried to put out relief to businesses during the COVID pandemic. You saw this with opportunity zones, which was another opportunity to try to revitalize distressed neighborhoods, totally missing the mark again. But they missed the mark because we don't ask fundamental questions. Who pays? Who benefits? Who decides? Who are the people that are centered in this conversation? And when I'm talking about who is centered, for me, living in the United States of America, I'm talking about the more than 140 million folks who are economically insecure. It's more than 1 in 3 people in America who are struggling. And so if we're going to have a conversation about transforming this economy, I believe that population has to be front and center. It's essential if you're talking about frontline workers, where there's 24 million plus. That's usually, especially how people of color will enter the workforce. And so if you don't center the people, and you can't explicitly do so, and you can't hold their interest, I believe that it will really be hard to make the transformative leaps forward that are necessary. Now, what I'm hopeful of is that I'm seeing business leaders step into this moment. They've been stepping into it, but in the United States, I'm seeing it more rapidly. And I'm seeing a couple of things. I'm seeing business leaders begin to realize that, like it or not, they are on the leading edge of the equity movement. And when I talk about the equity movement, I'm not talking about it in financial terms. I'm talking about it in terms of creating a just and fair society. Corporate America is on the leading edge of the equity movement because it has a set of skills that are uniquely suited for transformation. One of those skills is being able to deal with systems, our markets, to change the legal and regulatory framework of a nation so that it suits them. That is what we're talking about here. Nation building, transforming our nations so that they work for the most vulnerable and thus cascading benefits to everybody else. And that's what I want you to begin to think about, that we can't talk about these issues in a vacuum. That systems conversation is essential. And that means that we've got to talk about the legal and regulatory framework of the nation. And I know that that's what this conference is about. So that's why I'm excited. But I share that because oftentimes we think if we just tinker around the edges, if we just implement a few initiatives, we get there. We do not. By design in the United States, if you look at our series of laws over the years, it's constructed this system intentionally. It's not by happenstance. And yet, when we come to talk about transformation, we resist the very thing that is transformative, passing new laws and new regulations to do the things that we know we need to do. So I wanted to center that to make sure that you're thinking about who's centered as you think about transformation, who pays, who benefits, who decides. And in that equation of thinking about systems design, are we really thinking about radically transforming the left set of laws and regulations that govern our economy? I think that is essential. And then the last thing I'll say is this. Purpose is so powerful, but it doesn't start at the corporate level. I believe it starts at that management level. It starts with the individual. We use a frame called the person, role, and system frame. And we believe that who you are shows up in your role. And that is why me talking to you about centering the people is so important, because I can't actually do liberating work if I'm not centering and seeing the humanity of folks who don't look like me, who don't have my same interests, folks who I might not even see. And so as you think about those management practices that Rebecca talked about, think about what inside you has to be transformed so that you can take up your role in different ways. That individual work on the person is essential if we're going to be able to come into our organizations and lead the type of change that is essential. So think about centering entire populations that have been left behind. Think about, when you think about that systems work, think about changing the legal and regulatory framework of the nation so that it is more just and fair, whether you're talking about the economy and the democracy. And begin to think about what are the transformations that you can make in your person that can be then acted upon in your role within the firm. I think if we do those things, we will create a society that is just and fair, where everybody can prosper and reach their full potential. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Michael, for bringing some incredibly profound perspectives there. And I'd like to turn now to one of those business leaders who is on the cutting edge in the United States, David Gardner, who is the co-founder of The Motley Fool and also a board of directors member for Conscious Capitalism. David is the chief rule breaker at The Motley Fool, and that is a financial services company that he co-founded in 1993 alongside his brother, Tom. The Motley Fool's purpose is to make the world smarter, happier, and richer. To that end, David has picked stocks for a worldwide membership for 27 years and hosted his own weekly podcast, Rule Breaker Investing, since 2015. In October of 2018, he made his 200th consecutive monthly stock pick for the company's flagship service, Motley Fool Stock Advisor. And those 200 picks returned an average annualized return of 20.7% over 16 plus years versus the market's S&P 500 average of 7.5%. He is a board member at Conscious Capitalism and works with a lot of CEOs who are working on much of that internal transformation that Michael just spoke to. And he's also served on the Individual Investor Advisory Committee of the New York Stock Exchange and the Folger Shakespeare Library. David, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and I'm honored to be here, and I've really enjoyed and learned from each of the people I've heard so far. I'm going to be relatively brief, asking you to suffer a fool gladly, because I'm not sure that I have as much depth or life's work to share, having studied this space. I am a practitioner, though, in two regards. So I'll just say, first of all, as an entrepreneur, I just want to double underline pretty much everything Rebecca Henderson said in terms of the importance of purpose and how that's built over time. The Motley Fool is a young company in the grander scheme of things, and we're a very small company. We have about 470 employees spread around the United States of America and a little bit of the world. That's really small compared to most of the enterprises we're talking about today. Microsoft, Mars, Unilever, those are the real big dogs in this world. But I can tell you, having homebrewed a company over the course of 27 years with my brother Tom, our CEO, and people who really love capitalism when it's done well, that this model works. And especially if you were to ask any of our 470 employees today, what is the purpose of our company? Just about every one of them to a fool would be able to nail it verbatim. Now, that was not true 10 years ago, before we went on this journey of understanding and thinking more deeply about conscious capitalism and about the power of higher purpose to drive all of our organizations for profit and not for profit. It was not true. If you'd asked the relatively, let's say 220 fools back then, 10 years ago, what was our purpose, you would have gotten about 80 different answers. So I know I'm speaking to a lot of Saïd Business School students today and people who love business. And I can only just tell you that as a practitioner, entrepreneur, it is so powerful for us now to be united around that statement that Amanda shared earlier, to make the world smarter, happier, and richer. And the most important word in our purpose statement is the word "and," because you talk about inclusivity, as Michael just underlined very powerfully. We think a lot about how it's not about making people richer. It's about making them smarter and happier. And the Motley Fool, when it's doing its job well, it's always one with, never without the other two. If you ever have two of those, you have to have the third: smarter, happier, and richer. So we have been accelerated as a business by really pursuing purpose and driving it through everything that we do. We're honored to be presenting a case study with the help of the Saïd Business School, which will be after this session. And anybody who'd like to learn a little bit more about our culture, we love sharing our culture, and we learn so much from the cultures of others. Culture is built up over time. As Rebecca said, you can't announce your purpose or your culture and expect that to be something or to instantly create value. You have to earn it out there in the fields of life, and that's proven over time. And then the second and final thing I'll just lead off with is that, yes, I pick stocks. So that's what I love to do. And I specifically, for years now, have been driven by this vision. And I say this all the time to anybody who comes up to me, and the answer will be different for every person, but it's make your portfolio reflect your best vision for our future. And I really believe that that is what has enabled me to beat the market substantially over long periods of time. I'm always looking for the innovators. I'm looking for the good players, the companies that practice conscious capitalism, that understand the economics of mutuality. There are so many of them, really. I realize it may sound like a niche conference we're having here, and there aren't that many people who get it yet, but I see every day companies that got it 10 years ago, like Salesforce. We picked Salesforce for Motley Fool Rule Breakers at $6.89 in January 2009. Here we are now, 11 years later. Last week, Salesforce was announced as a new Dow Jones Industrials component. The company has pursued Mark Benioff's vision of a 1-1-1, which some of you may know, but for those who don't, they give away 1% of all their revenues every year to charity. They give away 1% of their employees' time to volunteering. You can just volunteer as a Salesforce employee with 1% of your time. They give away 1% of their product for free to those who couldn't have otherwise afforded it. That 1-1 model, that 1-1-1 model is contagious, and it's part of the power of Salesforce. Salesforce today, really happy to say, is at $245 a share. That's well ahead of the $7 where we picked it 11 years ago. By the way, I pick a lot of bad stocks too, so I hope nobody's hearing me bragging about stock picks. It's important to be able to lose and be wrong. I reserve that right and call myself a fool, and I encourage everybody to reserve that same right and call themselves the same for themselves. So I love capitalism. I truly believe it's a beautiful model. I see the innovation every day. I think about something like Zoom. This is my closing. I think about Zoom. Zoom was another player, Skype, FaceTime, etc. a year ago. But Eric Yuan, who is the immigrant founder here in the United States of America, owns about 20% of the stock. He talked about the importance of empathy and making a product that would work for everybody. Then came COVID. And when I finally picked the stock at $125 this March, it was already up a double from where my brother had picked it a year before. But I agreed with my brother, Tom, that the world is changing and we need to wake up and see what's happening. And at the time, Zoom was being called dramatically overvalued. Today, it's up another $30 a share. I think as we speak, it's up to about 382, which is a triple from when we picked it in March. Whether or not that is a valuation that will stand the test of time, it is a testament to the power of innovation. I truly do not believe that if anybody's government had decreed that there will be, during this COVID time, free workable video, that it would have been deployed in anything like the speed and the expertise that it has been. And you and I, picking businesses that make our portfolio reflect our best vision for the future, can be part owners of those enterprises. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. What a beautiful vision you created there at the end. And our final panelist, I would like to welcome to give us that more of a global perspective to scale back out is Gabriela Ramos. She comes to us from the Business for Inclusive Growth Initiative, where she was the chief of staff of the OECD. And she has advanced OECD's work on gender equality, the well-being framework, and children. In 2019, she launched the Business for Inclusive Growth platform that was endorsed by the French G7 presidency and brought together 40 major multinational companies committed to reducing inequalities. She's championed OECD's work to put people at the center of policymaking through the provision of targeted policy advice in partnership with the European Union, the Inclusive Growth Initiative, and new approaches to economic challenges. She's now the Assistant General for Social and Human Services at UNESCO, where her work is focused on building peace in the minds of men and women. So again, we're seeing that internal transformative thread coming out in everyone's experience here. Welcome to the panel, Gabriela. We'd love to have your contribution.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amanda. And I'm happy to be the last, because the reality is that I have really learned from all of the business practitioners and leaders that you have in this panel. I'm not a business practitioner. I'm just a believer that we got it wrong. And there might be ways in which we can build up a more sustainable and equitable world. And as Amanda mentioned, I started in the OECD working to look at how the policies that OECD countries particularly, and those are the most advanced in the world, had delivered something that in terms of sustainability for the environment, and in terms of equality for fairness, and as Michael said, in terms of outcomes for people, how did we got it so wrong? And you have heard the data. Of course, the OECD has also produced a lot of data in the sense of the distributions of the distribution of the benefit of growth being so skewedly shared, and how much this has created fractured societies and the sense of unfairness that is not conducive for any good business. And this is the context in which we are. You all mentioned the question of purpose. I feel that this is something that is very related to businesses, but at the OECD and now at UNESCO, we are also trying to redefine our goals. Of course, we have the Sustainable Development Goals and they are fantastic, but they are all encompassing. The whole point here is that if you look at the economic policy that we have been following in the major economies and also in my country, in Mexico, we have really focused on efficiency of markets. We have really focused on maximizing production. We have really focused in comparing countries in terms of competition through GDP numbers and through consumption and production, and nothing wrong with that. The only point is that it cannot be the only metrics to measure success. And I think this is where I coincide with what all the speakers are saying. We need to have a goal that really represent better outcomes for people, everybody, not only the lucky few. And we also need to have metrics that will help us to reach those goals. And we need to have incentives. I'm a believer that incentives always build up better outcomes. And you can, of course, build it through good regulatory frameworks, but many times it has to do with how the market functions and how do we make the market functions. And what we are promoting in the general terms, I think this is more systemic, is that we move away from GDP as the only metric to measure success. We need to go for a well-being framework. The OECD produced a well-being framework that has 11 dimensions, that has to do with education, with employment, quality employment, that has to do with environmental outcomes, that has to do with social networks, that has to do with subjective well-being, asking people what do they care about. And this is also for companies. Companies cannot assume that you know what your workers want. You cannot assume that the people that your consumers want. You need to hear them. You need to give them voice, and you need to include that. It's more complicated because it's much more straightforward to measure things that are measurable, but probably those things that are not measurable are sometimes much more important than the numbers we have in our books. So the whole question is the well-being framework. And then we realized that is not only about these dimensions of well-being, but also the distribution of the access to education. And you know, if you get into the deep analysis of how this is accumulating advantages or disadvantages for certain groups, let me just share one number. If you are born in a family whose parents have higher education, you have 60% chances of going to higher education. If you are born in a family with no education at that level in the parents, you only have 15% chances. So this is where we say your chances are settled since you are born, and are linked to your zip code and are linked to your nationality. And now we have all these news about racial outcomes, particularly in the US, but I think that this is true for every single country. And therefore, these numbers we need to change. The whole point is, how do we ensure that the distribution and the benefits of growth are widely shared? Rebecca mentioned this question of innovation and how far some big or productive companies are really the source of the major innovations. We are actually more worried about the fact that in the digital world, where you have this amazing progress in terms of innovation, productivity is flat. And this is the productivity conundrum, which tells you that if you go into microdata, instead of looking at averages, because we also need to move away from averages, that's fine as an indicator in general, but go into the distributional impacts, or also in the more detailed granular data. And what we found is that the top frontier firms, they're growing productivities at 3 to 6% in the last decade, while you have 40% of the companies flat. Therefore, the innovation machine is not trickling down. And therefore, that's why we are where we are and where we need to refill the system. So what goals? The well-being framework. What goals? Sustainability. What goals? Equality or equity. Equality in the sense of gender. And try to figure out how those goals have trade-offs. It's not as straightforward. Sometimes you will need to go for efficiency. Sometimes you will need to go for equity. Sometimes you will need to go for sustainability. So the fact is, how do you ensure that the balance is not just always favoring one specific goal, but looking at which of those are going to be delivering better for people? And I have to say that we were very proud to work with this group of companies, with Emmanuel Faber, the chairman of Danone, who brought together with President Macron and with the OECD this Business for Inclusive Growth, 40 companies who are saying it's not about in the margins, it's about the core of the strategy of the businesses. And it's about respecting human rights, and it's about promoting inclusive business practices. It's about inclusive impact in our ecosystem, and it's about metrics. If we don't have the metrics, and if we don't have the incentives, and if the financial markets do not reward this new way of seeing things, the change is going to be not as fast as we want. Although I'm very optimistic when I hear all of you. I think that the movements that were born out of this reflection that we got it wrong because of the financial crisis of 2008, or because of the climate emergency, or because of the inequalities, have gained new power with the COVID. And I really want to say, please, business sector, please realize the world that we are going to have after COVID. If we thought that we were in bad shape, you don't know what is going to happen. Because for some, the COVID crisis meant teleworking and finding a very nice way to organize life, going to your secondary residence to enjoy more space if you live in Paris, for example, while others, and the majority of people, was just losing lives, losing livelihoods, and losing their hopes for lives. So I think that the COVID is again another wake-up call to say we need to accelerate the transformation, we need to adopt new goals, and we need to adopt new ways of measuring those goals and to achieve a much more sustainable future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gabriela, for sharing that perspective. And I want to pick up on, I'm going to direct this first question primarily to Mark and David with their experience as practitioners and working with executives, to pick up on what Gabriela just spoke to about accelerating the transition. We all know that business executives, as Alistair pointed out, have a finite period of time. They're operating businesses, they are cultivating the culture inside of their companies, and yet there are 180 plus movements looking to support them in making this transition. And I'm wondering, from your perspective and what you've seen, what are the most effective ways to do that? Are there some ways that these movements might be able to collaborate better, or specific examples of what executives need to support them in being part of accelerating that change? So Mark, would you like to start us off on that?
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the areas that I could have mentioned as a shortcoming, of course, is our own work in silos. And I'm so glad that Bruno and Colin and others are leading the way and thinking about that as a system. I think that in terms of particularly just lowering the confusion in the guidance that's being given and finding sort of the common ground and the powerful and pragmatic ground that business can grab to, I think there's an immense piece of work there. And I think there are some, you know, funders, philanthropic funders, who are interested in actually, you know, getting us to this new state of what some call the new economy, and can resource this process of, you know, all of us spending the time to actually align and add, you know, the sum of the part being worth a lot more. So I think that is one mechanism. But, you know, as we were listening, there are others, and I just, you know, I think the legislative hammer has to fall on purpose. I think that has to be a great accelerator. I do think that it was interesting in hearing both Paul, Michael talk about, you know, issues of the self, of humanity, of solidarity versus management guidance. I do think that, you know, there's something there also that's very, very important, that, you know, what we tend to focus on as movements are management practices. How do we accelerate the solidarity and humanity piece? I don't have an answer, but I think that's part of it as well. I'll just stop there. Just a couple of thoughts.
Yeah, thank you.
One
David?
thought is just that we are such social creatures. Everybody knows about the 6 degrees of separation. Well, there are also the 3 degrees of influence, which, phrased one way, my wife's coworker's cousin helped me lose weight. And you'll never actually meet your wife's coworker's cousin, but that's because through 3 degrees of association, we're constantly influencing each other. So one of the things I love about the stock market is we're constantly seeing prices change and values drive up over time, and it's public. And even though we were taught in school not to look over at the person's shoulder to the next desk over and copy what they're doing, it's constantly happening in the business world. I think most MBA students would recognize that. So I think that the good news is the big players out there really garner their own rewards, and whether they inspire envy or imitation in those around them. I just think about companies like Starbucks and what it's done, or a smaller company like Etsy. NextEra Energy, which is a power company here in Florida, is the world's #1 purveyor of solar and wind. These are all wonderful companies, both to work for and performers on the stock market. Netflix, Tesla, look at how much the world is willing to accord Tesla in terms of its valuation, because the power of a vision for profit to change over to electric cars. And look at how the rest of the industry didn't really catch up. And now Tesla, at least temporarily, is worth what the rest of its industry is worth. So I really believe that public market pricing and just seeing what's working out there and our human nature, which I'm positive on human nature. I love my fellow humans, and I think we all learn from each other. And so these are all great opportunities to influence. And look what we're all doing today. We're all influencing each other and helping each other see new things.
Yeah, thank you, David.
And just
go ahead, Michael.
One thing to add would be, FSG has done a lot of work in this area around collective impact. And so this is where I think civil society can merge with the specific values that we bring. One opportunity I'm seeing happen in the United States is around folks like JP Morgan Chase, the Business Roundtable, beginning to talk to folks like PolicyLink and others around what would it mean for us to close the racial wealth gap, and beginning to align contributions to do that work. I think when we come together around a powerful result and then think about redesigning our ecosystem, designing an ecosystem so that we can actually win on the issue is quite powerful. That is that collective impact work that FSG really brought to us as a really powerful frame for getting results at scale. So I just wanted to share that because I'm seeing some companies begin to do that. And the thing that I'm seeing them do is to first center a population, declare a powerful result, and one or two key metrics that they're going to use to assess their success. And then they're not just beginning to do the work, they're actually reimagining. How do we have to organize ourselves? How do we have to create new infrastructure? How does that ecosystem need to be redesigned, reimagined, so that it can deliver on what we're trying to do? And so I just wanted to point to the collective impact body of work as some practical ways civil society can partner with business to do that. And business is showing us some ways to actually begin to think about this by actually joining with civil society right now in ways that we haven't worked together in the past to actually come up with shared strategies, shared measurement, shared results.
Yeah, thank you very much for bringing that up, Michael. And I was actually going to move to you with another question on this, the practical application side. You've mentioned it in your opening remarks, and I want to really kind of stick a pin in this topic and bring it out to conversation. Racial inequality seems to be an Achilles heel, a blind spot for many in the United States, as you've talked about. Why is that? And what are some of the ways that companies can start to address that with their corporate policies and operations?
Well, it is that way because the nation was designed to be this way. And you see the debate right now where we won't even acknowledge that. You just saw recently the directive from this administration that says any anti-racist training, any of that type of stuff has to stop. So we can't even reconcile our past. So it's really hard to move to the things that we're talking about when we all come from very different frames around understanding what the nature and the logic of the problem is. And so that's part of our structural problem where it's hard for us to be in transformative solidarity with each other because we really don't see systems of oppression that are hiding in plain sight every day, including myself, who now is in a very different economic bracket than the way I came up. I miss things because I don't live that world anymore. But I think that there is opportunity for us to get beyond it. And I'm seeing corporations do it. Let's take those frontline workers as an example. I'm seeing companies get consistent around schedules. Imagine how hard it is if you've got a family and you just don't even know what your schedule is day to day. I'm seeing folks understand that charity begins at home, places like Target, which is increasing the minimum wage and saying that's how we're going to put a marker down. We're seeing the powerful of places like Prudential, where they're helping people create portable benefits. Since we know in the United States, your benefits really can help you not fall into poverty. And so we're seeing them work with like the California legislature to make sure that you have a portable benefits package. We see places like JP Morgan Chase, who has created something explicitly called Black Pathways to make sure that as the nation changes, that you've got folks who can enter the financial services sector. So you're seeing this type of leadership coming from businesses, which is quite remarkable. And now what we need to do is not just see it in that piecemeal way, but begin to think about the scaling challenges of what we've been talking about. But there are examples like that all around the country where leaders are stepping up and becoming actually bigger than the statements that they've recently made around like the George Floyd murder.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. So we're seeing these transformations happening in individual leaders. Talked a little bit about how some of the movements might be able to do work together. And Rebecca, I want to turn to you and ask you, with the research that you've done and what you've seen with firms, do you think firms could start to work together as what they might be considered in a traditional setting, competitors? How do you see that as a potential stepping stone for reimagining capitalism?
I see it as a hugely important piece of the puzzle, Amanda. There are so many problems that it's hard for an individual firm to solve, but if everyone in the industry agrees to collectively address them, the odds that they will succeed go right up. I mean, the example that Michael mentioned of Target raising minimum wage for its workers, I suspect they're following Walmart that also did the same thing. And Walmart has been trying to spearhead a program which really addresses the question of education at the entry level in retail. How do we make sure that people who are coming in on the ground floor have the kinds of qualifications that they need, that they can rise up in the companies and maybe go to other industries like hospitality or retail? No single company can take on something like that alone. But together, if all the big firms in retail came together and said, you know, we're really going to invest in education for our entry-level workers, we're going to develop a certification system, we're going to support colleges and universities in teaching that, that could make a huge difference. I mean, similarly, Michael gestured, I think, in this direction too. We're seeing companies come together in regions saying, okay, if we're going to address this massive issue of racial inequality that we have, we really need to focus on the quality of our healthcare and educational systems and our transportation systems here in this city. No single company can do that, but if everyone in the city comes together and together we make this a great place to work and one where we can get people of every kind of background being able to join our company, that would make a huge difference. I ran into a group of CEOs in Orange County, California. And I don't know about you, but I don't think of Orange County as like the world's leading edge on progressive social programs, but I am out of date. I mean, these CEOs together are trying to transform the educational system in Orange County because half of their high school graduates are people of color, and they're not succeeding at work in the way that white people are. And so what can be done? How do the firms reach out? How do they partner with the schools? What can they do to make that work? Again, it has to be all the firms working together. If we can see that kind of collaboration, it's not a solution, but it's another piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, thank you. And hopefully some of those folks will be meeting as they're participating in the forum, and we can accelerate that collaboration together. We're getting a number of questions from the audience members, and so I want to turn to a few of those. And Gabriela, there's a lot of interest in the last part of your opening remarks that I'm going to take a few questions and kind of merge them together. Folks are wondering if you can talk more about the importance of leaders as individuals embracing and focusing on transforming their mindset to being one of more creativity and imagination, as well as keying in on empathy and care, so that can really solve the challenges that we're facing post-COVID.
That's a question that is bigger than life.
Indeed, it is.
Because the reality is that if you see the countries, how did they perform in terms of addressing the crisis? And I have to say, as of course, this might seem like a commercial, but it's true that women leaders were more successful in terms of taking the measures that need to be taken very fast, maybe because they're more risk averse, and I'm getting into the stereotyping. But the reality is that New Zealand, Germany, Iceland, and Finland, some of these countries that happen to be run by women, they have higher levels of trust. And this is what makes the whole difference. Because if the government comes out and say, guys, you cannot go out, well, they don't go out. But whereas in the US, we know what happens. In France, we know what happens. People are not really taking advice, and there is not so much this following of the leadership. The fact is that there's nothing more important than leadership. That's a fact. When you see which countries were better prepared in terms of the institutional development for dealing with the pandemic, 2 years before this report was done by one of the US universities, or it was a UK university, comparing which countries were better prepared, and it was the UK and the US. What happened? We know all what happened. A leader comes, a leader feels that they don't need to be prepared for anything. They don't care about risks, or they are more risk takers. They don't listen to the science, which is something that in UNESCO we're really worried, because science-based policy making is really needed in many parts of the world. And what they did was just to defund these institutions that were in charge of pandemic handling. Therefore, yes, we need better leadership. How do you go for building the leadership that we need? You need to deal with what Michael was commenting, the political economy. The political economy, and I'm getting into very tough issues that we are not analyzing deeply in international institutions, because this is for our members, but how you finance political campaigns, how you choose those that are going to be leading, how do we move away from this very confrontational mood in which we are in so many countries. But you need leadership, and the leadership is built up with positive inputs and with positive outcomes, or you have leaders that are just based their narrative in confronting and blaming others, and in reducing the sphere for what they are responsible to deliver for people.
Thank you, Gabriela. And you've all touched on the importance of purpose and authenticity. A number of the questions, in the interest of time, I'm going to meld them into one question, and we're going to do a round robin here to close out the panel, are really keying in on and liking to hear from each of you more about this internal transformation. Some of you talked about it as a personal thing you've experienced, something you've studied, something you've seen impact a community or a business ecosystem. And since our conversation is really about what business movement leaders and the movements themselves can do to enact this systemic change, it's really a shift in mindset from a shareholder focus to a stakeholder focus. And so keeping that in mind, what would you say is the one or two key things that you would consider are essential that people embody in their personal transformation so that they can act in accelerating that transition? And let's see, I'm going to start with Michael on this one.
I would say a heart full of grace, because we don't get to, there's not a lot of time to grieve, and there's not a lot of time to want to exact revenge for things that have been, harms that have been done to you, or wrongs that have been done to the broader humanity or to our planet. We've got to be willing. In our equity manifesto, we say, very first sentence says it begins by joining. And that is really fundamentally the work, to actually want to join with others to create a just and fair society. And I use the word grace and a heart full of grace to signal that there are going to be times when we're having great successes, and there's going to be times that we're in the valleys, and the things that we care about, the purpose that we're trying to live into, is not going to be popular, and that is okay. And our job is to not to become angry, to not become judgmental, to not attack, but to stay steadfast in the work, and to know that peace is actually found in that struggle, in this struggle to bring about equity globally. And so that's what I would say is needed, is this heart full of grace to continue to do the work, and to continue to understand that our fates are inextricably bound, and that I can never achieve the scale by myself. So whether I like it or not, my job is to join with others.
Beautiful. Thank you. Gabriela, what would you say?
Well, I would say that, yes, there needs to be a conviction. There needs to be an understanding. There needs to be evidence. I think that we need to listen to the evidence. If you see that the world is not delivering the outcomes for everybody to create an harmonious society, I think that we need to and I feel that all the business leaders that you call in this very impressive conference, they have a good side. They're good humans, but they also understand that it's very dangerous the way we are evolving. And therefore, that is not, as I said at the beginning, good for business to have all these divisions and these people so angry at the results of growth. So I would say, how do we ensure, and this is a question that I push back to my panelists because they are working on these topics, how do we ensure that we reward behaviors, and this goes for the financial markets, but it also goes for the society as a whole, that really underscore the need for solidarity and compassion. And I recommend that you take a look at the life of Kailash Satyarthi, who is this Nobel laureate who is saving children from slavery. And he just came out one day and say, I'm going to do that. And he's doing it. And he always says, why don't we globalize compassion? All the things have been globalized. And so we need to globalize compassion.
That's beautiful. Thank you. And I'm going to ask our last three panelists to share their comments more briefly so we can try to stay on time here. So many wonderful thoughts here. David, what would you contribute to this final thought?
Sure. I think an abundance mentality is really helpful. After all, stakeholder capitalism teaches us it's not about one group, right? We're not just trying to max it out for these people, shareholders. We're trying to create a win for everybody. So it's that win-win-win mentality. A lot of people don't come at it that way. We watch sports, we see one winner, one loser. We think it's zero-sum, dog eat dog. Not that many dogs eat dogs, by the way. And it really does come down, I think, to this notion. Henry Ford said, whether you think you can or whether you think you cannot, you're right. So I think that it's the optimism, it's the optimists, it's that abundance mentality that the world will really benefit from.
Yeah, thank you, David. And Rebecca. Oh, you're muted. There we go.
I think it's all about keeping an open heart, an open mind, and deep compassion. There's so much hurt and despair and anger and rushing. And as leaders, and we're all leaders, we have to hold ourselves in a place that is open to the world and open to others. And with deep compassion, I love what Gabriella said, a deep understanding that everybody is hurting and we need to work together to get where we need to be.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Mark, give you the final word.
Yeah, no, I thought about my kids and how young, I would appeal to human nature to want to contribute, to want to invent, to want to create potential. Human nature doesn't, and the youth don't want to stagnate. They don't want the status quo. They want to always push beyond. That's what I get to purpose.
Thank you. Well, there is so much we could continue to explore together, but we are at the end of our time. And I just want to thank you on behalf of all the panelists and the Economics of Mutuality team for joining us, sharing your perspectives. And we look forward to staying in touch and looking for those new innovations and collaborations as we move forward. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Speaking about the idea of children and youth and the idea that there is human nature to not stagnate and continue to innovate and look towards the future, we are going to be welcoming a keynote from an MBA at Oxford University, Nicole Yazon. She is passionate about engineering, energy, and the environment. And she is a chemical engineer by training. She started her career in the oil and gas industry in the Philippines, where she worked to reduce the environmental footprint of assets through energy efficiency and water management projects. And her goal was really to increase the use of lower carbon fuels and technologies. She is a Pershing Square Fellow and a 1-1 MBA student, holds an MSc in Environmental Change and Management, and is also the co-chair of the Oxford Business Network for Climate. So Nicole, I'd like to welcome you to the stage to share your keynote.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you to our panelists for inspiring us and for challenging us. As we reflect on what we've learned today about systems change and transformation, I want to share with you my own experience with the challenges of putting these ideas into practice. The story I'm going to share is from a project I worked on while I was working for Shell. The bad news is, I have to echo what Mark, Rebecca, and our panelists have emphasized. Putting purpose into practice is tough. The good news, and what I hope to illustrate, is that it can be done. And if we come up with some examples, even in the oil and gas industry, then surely we can imagine profitable solutions for people and planet in any business. I came to Oxford after spending 6 years working as an engineer at an oil refinery in the Philippines. I looked after utility systems, and part of my job was to improve energy efficiency and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. In 2016, Shell had just launched its new energies division, and announced plans to invest $1 to $2 billion each year on low carbon energy projects. The new energies team was looking for use cases, and there was a lot of interest in installing solar PV in our own refineries and petrochemical plants. I was asked to assess the business case for a solar project at our refinery. This proposal created a lot of excitement within the company. Everybody rallied behind the idea. Some people think oil and gas folks, they are the enemy, always dreaming up more ways to prevent the energy transition and destroy the environment. The enemy. Somebody I once met said that to me when I told them where I worked. And I can understand that. But the truth is, we want what most people want. We want to do work we can be proud of. We love a good challenge. And we want to be part of the solution. And here, finally, was our chance to prove it. But when I analyzed the impact this project would have on our systems, I found some problems with the idea. And here is why. The refinery was self-reliant and self-contained. We generated just as much power as we required, and we had no way of storing excess power. Bringing in some solar power to meet a portion of this demand would mean running our gas turbines at lower loads, and thus operating them much less efficiently. Second, we relied on waste heat from the turbine gases to make steam. Power generated from solar would not contribute to meeting our steam demand. So we would have to burn more gas anyway to produce the steam we needed. Overall, these efficiency losses outweighed any cost savings and environmental benefits from the project. Our energy bill would be much higher, and there would be little to no emissions reduction. There would be no point. And yet, I found myself having to argue against a project that many people had become very attached to. Every time I presented my analysis, I would see faces fall. First, disappointment, then disbelief, and finally, resistance. People would say, "It can't be. Are you sure? Can you check again?" And again, and again. I became so exasperated and I pushed back against the new energies team, saying, why not do this where it makes sense, where we don't need the heat, office buildings or petrol stations? And the response I kept getting was this: because powering refineries with solar would make a better story. And so we went back and forth for months, trying to make the solution fit in the context we wanted, but no amount of tweaking would change the underlying thermodynamics. It simply was not going to work the way we first imagined. We shelved the project, and I thought, there goes our one chance to be part of the solution. But something kept nagging at me in the back of my mind. It kept me coming back to this idea. And so I started to play around with my simulations again. I realized that we could try something else. Instead of reducing the load on our gas turbines to bring in solar power, we could increase efficiency by producing more power, because at higher loads, each megawatt of power would require less fuel. We would also generate more waste heat for steam production. But the excess power would need an outlet. Maybe it could be sold to the national grid or to other facilities in the area. And this power would actually have a lower carbon intensity than the existing national power mix, which at the time was over 50% based on coal and oil. We would make a profit by selling the power, and by operating more efficiently and displacing more carbon-intensive power generation on the grid, we would prevent around 30,000 tons of carbon dioxide emissions each year. This was promising, but it had challenges of its own. We had never considered exporting power in the past. Before 2015, we weren't even connected to the grid. The Philippine grid used to be very unstable, and the long-standing view was that it was better to produce our own power and stay islanded. Power production was also not part of our core business and identity. We were refiners. Our purpose was to produce quality fuel products and maximize profits. Legally, we were also restricted to the purposes declared in our articles of incorporation, all of which revolved around fuel production and marketing. It took our team some time to convince the wider organization to reimagine and expand our purpose to move in this direction. But eventually, the board of Shell Philippines voted to amend the company's articles of incorporation to include the sale of electricity. It wasn't quite the story we hoped for in the beginning, but it aligned with the science, it made better use of our assets, and it was a profitable solution that was also good for the planet. My hope is that this story will encourage anyone out there who is working on business transformation. With the many crises and world challenges we face today, there is work that needs to be done in every industry and every business. Here are my 3 thoughts for when you embark on your own transformation journey. First, start with a question, not with a technology or a storyline or answers you think you already know. Some things may seem obvious and easy, like power production from solar must be better than gas for the environment. As it turns out, the easy and obvious green option is not always the right thing. Real-world systems are complex. We have to embrace complexity and do the hard work to understand what the right thing is. Second, you will come up against some dead ends. When you do, think again. Are those barriers real or constructed? We tend to draw artificial boundaries around our systems. In our case, for as long as we continue to think of our utility system as an island that served only to provide energy for our own operations, no amount of optimization would have unlocked as much value as we found when we began to look at the wider system. So look beyond the borders you know. This is where methods from the economics of mutuality, like ecosystem mapping, can help by identifying areas of innovation that are adjacent to your core business. Lastly, I can guarantee that if you keep doing these 2 things, asking questions and testing boundaries, you will find yourself, as I did, in deep discomfort. Lean into it. That is how you find opportunities that are truly transformational and valuable. What might emerge is something even more disruptive than you imagined. Let me leave you with the latest development in this story that is still unfolding. Last year, my former team at Shell sent me a photo. It was a solar panel on site at the refinery. The changes we made to allow the export of power eventually paved the way for the solar project to continue. But instead of using the solar power for refinery operations, they are using idle land and existing transmission infrastructure to produce even more power for the grid. 2 of my former teammates now work in the new energies division. And who knows, maybe in 10 or 20 years, when people think of Shell, they will no longer associate the name with just oil and gas or the enemy. I believe it can be done. And remember, if the oil and gas folks can do it, so can you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. What an amazing way to close out the formal part of our main session today. As a reminder, Nicole told us, embrace complexity, do the hard work, look beyond the borders that you know, and make sure that you're asking questions and pushing boundaries. So we hope that you do that not only during your time here at the forum as a participant, but also as we each go out and do our work in the world. We are going to be having an opportunity in our after hours program in about 10 minutes to learn from, as David Gardner referenced, a case study on his company, The Motley Fool, as well as an additional case study on Welsh water. These are going to be separate sessions that we invite you to join. They are an hour long, and you will have an opportunity to dive deeper into what this theory looks like in practice, as well as ask questions of those executives and how the challenges and opportunities went along with their implementation. So we look forward to seeing you there in about 10 minutes. And I would like to thank you for joining us today. And we hope to see you tomorrow for day 2 of the Oxford Economics of Mutuality Forum. Thank you so much.